When I left Australia and moved to Indonesia, I went absolutely feral, and it goes something like this. But I mean that in the best possible way, of course. It was like I'd done a long stint in jail and just gotten out. And that feeling of freedom that I felt immediately upon getting here just let out my inner animal, and I just let loose. I allowed myself to experience Indonesia in all its rawness, getting acquainted with the local ways of using the toilet, the local ways of traveling, maybe staying in a local losmen and getting used to the way things are in those sorts of places, and dropping some of my hygiene standards when it comes to eating food in warongs and so forth. It was just total chaos in those first couple of years, but geez, it was an experience. Today, I want to take you through exactly what that looks like when you have the freedom that you're exposed to when you move to a place like Indonesia for the first time and you're let loose. So let's get stuck in. Let's start where all good stories start, in the toilet. There's a thing in Indonesia called the bum gun. It's that little hose that's next to all the toilets that you'll see around the place. And when you first see it, it's absolute horror about what that thing is. But what happens when you live here for quite a while, you start using that thing, and at first it can be quite chaotic with water spraying everywhere. You're getting wet from the waist down to your feet, and there's just water everywhere, and it's just crazy. For most Aussies, it'll seem more like a weapon than it does a hygiene device. But actually, once you get used to the bum gun, you find out that using toilet paper is a little bit barbaric. It's basically just a smearing job, isn't it? Like if you had bird poo on your arm, what are you going to do? Do you smear it off with a paper towel, or do you go and get some water and wash it off? Well, you can get away with it with a paper towel, but it does a better job if you splash a bit of water on it, go to the sink and wash it off. That's what we're talking about with the bum gun. Now, a word of warning for those uninitiated with the bum gun. They come in all different pressures. And the first time you use one, you better not put it on full blast, otherwise you're going to tear yourself a new one. That's for sure. We've all done that before. So what you'll find is that once you get initiated with it, you'll be putting it on the lowest setting possible, squeezing that handle just a little bit to see how it goes, and then you'll ease up the pressure from there. Don't put it on full blast. Trust me on that. Feral? Maybe, but in this scenario, I think I'm the clean one. But before the bum gun came along, it was the squat toilet. And everyone who's done long distance travel in Indonesia has had to endure a squat toilet at some point. And the thing is, if you're going on a bus journey from Jakarta to Surabaya and it takes 10 hours or what have you, at some point in your journeys through Indonesia, you're going to have to come face to face with a squat toilet. And what do you do about it? The first question is always, how badly do I need to go? And the second one is always, if it's badly enough, what do I do next? Because it's a bit of an art form when you go into one of these squat toilets that's usually always wet. So you can't just rip in there, get your pants off around your ankles and go for it. You'll end up with a bit of a disaster. You've actually got to get completely naked from the waist down. And once you learn that little trick, it'll make life a lot easier. But the squat toilet story that sticks with me and is seared into my brain and will never leave is one that happened in North Sumatra in a place called Bukit Lawang. I was staying in a place for $2 a night. And on that particular trip, I had feared that maybe I was going to have to come face to face with a squat toilet. But I didn't realise it was going to be so early in the trip and in this little guest house I'd chosen to stay in. I had no choice but to get used to that squat toilet. Just a hole in the bathroom floor, 2 foot plates and a bucket of water. I'll be absolutely honest with you, once you get the geometry of all of that down pat, your body knows what to do. It's nature. You know, it's actually the way that humans have existed for millennia. That's not the issue though. There are other issues with it. Indonesia has a habit of building toilets over little ponds. And at this point in time, I didn't realize that. So what I was doing is going to the toilet and I was dropping into a pond that the hut was built over. And that for me just looked like a little lake outside the guest house. Well, little did I know at the time is that the fish in that lake were fed by the toilets that were perched directly on top of it. And that night we were served up an absolute feast of Indonesian food, and it was just glorious to have one of my first large Indonesian feasts like that. And the prime thing on the menu was ikan goreng, and geez was it tasty. Ikan goreng is fried fish with sambal. It was so good. But I didn't know it at the time what the actual story was about my squat toilet and the relationship to those fish. It was not long after that that I discovered that what we sort of refer to as feral is just normal in other parts of the world. It's these cultural differences that are so unique and make living life so wonderful. Feral to some, completely normal to others. In Australia, a leaking roof is absolute disaster. You're onto a tradesman, you're getting someone over there as soon as possible, you're putting an insurance claim in if it's damaged your ceiling. A bit of rising damp and you're onto your landlord saying, I've got mold in my house, I've got rising damp, I need it fixed. And it's an absolute disaster, and everyone will agree that this is totally unacceptable. In Indonesia, it's a different story. When it rains, the roof is probably going to leak. In almost all the places I've lived in Indonesia, when you get these big storms ripping through, you're probably going to have a leak. Now, you put a bucket under it for starters and just hope it doesn't get too bad and it doesn't collapse your ceiling. In fact, a lot of houses will have older style ceilings where they're called triplek. And the reason you have that is that they are easy to replace in sheets rather than just having one large sheet like you might have in Australia. You have these little squares that you can pull off and put new ones on because you know it's going to leak again. When I first moved to Debunking in West Java, the house I was living in was a 2-story house and it had a leak on the lower floor. So it had a leak coming from the roof of the lower floor, but when I went above the leak to the second floor, I had a concrete floor. So that leak was coming from somewhere that I just couldn't really determine. And the landlord wasn't going to fix it. The funny thing is, the first time that it leaked was at night, and I had the light on, and it was like Niagara Falls in flood coming through the actual light socket. But it didn't trip the electricity, and the light stayed on. So I just put a bucket under it and just hoped for the best. And when the rain stopped, the dripping stopped. And then it happened again the next night, and it just went on like that until I left that place. That place just leaked through that light socket, and that was okay. And you sort of adapt to that. And yeah, some people say, oh, but you're going to get mold, it's going to get dirty and all this sort of stuff. But you sort of have to adapt because there's no choice. You can't fix it. It was not built the right way in the first place. And that's sort of repeated all around Indonesia. It's quite often the case that you're going to have a leaky roof, and fixing it is not always as easy as just getting a guy in to come and rearrange some tiles. It may need a whole new roof to be put on, and even then it might not get fixed. Becoming feral and coping with how things are here also means accepting that things go wrong in your house and you might need to live with them that way for quite a while. It might be a week, it might be a month, it might be a year, it might be forever. There was one incident where I actually had floor tiles explode in my house, and they exploded with such a bang, I actually thought the house was collapsing. It really felt like it. It was an actual explosion that was deafening. Now, it took me quite a while to get that repaired. I had to get a tradesman in. Well, not really a tradesman, just some dude to come and put some new tiles down. And, you know, I would imagine that that would have happened again in the years after I left there as well. And then there was a civet cat in my roof. It lived up there. Now, if you don't know what a civet cat is, it's one of those things that you see that does that kopi luwak stuff. It's one of those things. So it's sort of like a cross between a ferret and a weasel, one of those sorts of animals. It's not really a cat, it's a big animal. And this thing had been living in my roof for quite a while. I'm making a bit of a ruckus up there. Was it nesting? I don't know. It was doing something up there for quite a while. And one night I'd had enough, so I thought, I'm gonna go on the roof and confront it. So it was that night, took up my torch, got on the tiled roof and started walking towards it, shined my torch onto it, and it just stopped in its tracks and sort of looked back like this. And I could see its eyes glowing in the torchlight. And then it just bore its teeth at me and made a deep grunting sound like, not today. And I thought it was going to attack. And I sort of beat a hasty retreat from there, and that was it. That civet cat came back the next night and lived in my roof, and I didn't confront it again. This is not a complaint about Indonesian housing standards. It's about accepting that standards here are different to what they are in Australia. And once you accept that and you integrate a little bit to the local expectations, a lot of the anxiety around it goes away. So if you do get a leaky roof, it's not the end of the world. Like, you can cope with it. If you have a bit of rising damp, that's okay. If a wall collapses, big deal. Get someone to come and fix it at some point. If you're coming here to live, you have to lower some of your expectations. And that means lowering some of the walls you've built up about how things should be and just accepting that things are different here. Indonesian traffic operates on a totally different philosophical framework to what it does in Australia. For example, in Australia, rules are rules, and red means stop, the footpath is for pedestrians, the lane markings mean something, there's speed limits. None of that applies here in Indonesia. Now, while there are rules, they're not really tightly enforced, and the culture is built up around that to allow people to sort of, feel their way around as they're on the road. In Indonesia, traffic is more like a living, breathing organism. You sort of have to go with the flow. And if everyone else is up on the footpath, you've got to decide, am I going to compromise what I think is right, or am I going to go with all the locals and do something that I know is wrong? And it's a really difficult philosophical point to get right in your head when you first encounter it. One of the things I sort of said when I first met Susan was, and when I started driving a lot in Indonesia, I just said to her, look, bear with me, I'm going to put in my Indonesian brain and I'm going to adapt to the Indonesian way of doing things here. Because there's no other way to handle it. If you're the one stuck in traffic and everyone else is scooting up the footpath or running red lights, you can cause some real problems. And a good example of that was when I first moved to Susan's house in Bandung. Near her house, there's a red light there, or an intersection, and that red light is never obeyed by people, but I didn't know it the first time I went there. So I pulled up in a car and stopped at the red light, and I had a queue of people behind me honking like you wouldn't believe, saying go, go, go. And it wasn't until Susan told me, hey, people don't really take notice of that light, that I realised that, hey, I've got to really shift my approach here. So in the future, I absolutely never, ever stopped at that red light again. And you know what? I never saw one other person in my 12 years there stop at that red light either. Yeah, that's a bit like living like a feral as well, isn't it, really? There's one funny incident that happened. There's lots of level crossings or railway crossings in Indonesia, and there was one main one that used to be always traffic jams across. And so you sort of queue up and you try not to get caught on the railway tracks while the booms come down. And we were pretty good about that because people know that you can get ploughed down by a train if you queue across the railway tracks, although a recent case just last week in Jakarta showed that people do still get hit by trains going across level crossings. But this is a different case. What was happening in this particular case was our car went to the railway tracks really slowly because we were sort of going slowly across the tracks. But the tracks had potholes on either side of the tracks. So the track was sort of that high with a pothole on either side. And rather than it just being flat and going across, what had happened was, and it was raining at the time, Susan's wheel got stuck over the other side of the rail. So she gave it a bit of gas and the wheels just spun. It did not move at all. And then all of a sudden, we hear the bells, ding, 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 and the barrier's coming down. And it's raining and we're stuck in traffic and the car won't go. And I was saying, give us some gas, give us some gas. She was, and there's nothing happening. So I jumped out of the car and no one else was helping, it was just me on my own. I was rocking the car back and forth on this rail in this pothole, rocking it back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. And she was spinning the wheels and all of a sudden it got grip and she shot off. And then she didn't just shoot off, she went like 300 metres down the road and I had to run down the road in the pouring rain trying to catch her. I think she was a bit embarrassed because this is another thing in Indonesia. People get embarrassed by these little incidents. I don't care too much, but Indonesians get really shy and embarrassed when these sorts of things happen. She wanted to get out of there. That was pretty funny. Back in the days before booking.com and pre-booking your accommodation, you would always arrive in a losmen as you were traveling through Sumatra, Java, Sulawesi, places like that. And a losmen is basically a budget accommodation. And the pillow is not usually too functional. You'll have mozzies in the room and there'll always be an incident in the ceiling at some point during the night, whether it be rats or cockroaches the size of mice, or some like maybe a civet cat again. There was always some problem with these places. But you sort of got used to them because you didn't really have any other choice. You'd often be arriving there at midnight, or you'd be in a town that doesn't really have any other accommodation options. And accommodation back in those days wasn't as modern as it is now anyway. That was a real roughing it style of travel. And I remember one of the One of the most memorable incidents that happened to me was that one night I was just drifting off to sleep and the bed collapsed, literally collapsed onto the floor. I found myself on the floor in the dark trying to figure out what am I doing with my life here in the middle of nowhere on a collapsed bed in the dark. But after a little bit of investigation, I realised that the bed was being held together by a really tiny old rope that had perished over the years. And obviously when I'd got onto that bed, it was threadbare, only a few threads holding it together. And that little last turn before I drifted off to sleep had snapped the last remaining thread and I'd just come crashing down. Now, under any other circumstance, you'd go to the front desk and complain and say, I need another room. But because you're only paying a couple of bucks a night and you've got no other choices in that town, you just sling the mattress on the floor and you get back to sleep and deal with it the next day, which is what I did. And that's really the thing about losmen. They're kind of a last resort, the place that you sort of end up in late at night when you need a cheap room. You're not really too concerned about facilities and you just roll with it. And sometimes that means literally rolling off the bed and onto the floor in the middle of the night. But the one thing I always take with me from those losmen journeys is that you don't need as much as you think to be perfectly happy, because some of those years are the happiest years of my life, traveling around budget style through Indonesia. I absolutely love it. And it sort of has set me up here in Indonesia to be able to cope with all sorts of different adversities. Even though I've got a nice house that I live in now, I'd be quite happy to live in losmen style accommodation if I had to. You'll see from the photo here that something happened this day, and there's a bit of a story behind it. And gee, did I feel feral after this day's adventures. What happened was I was researching for a guidebook. I used to write guidebooks back in the day, and I was in central Java going across the province, about 300 kilometers in total for that day, and I got an ojek. An ojek is a motorcycle taxi. You'll see the word gojek used a lot now, but that's just the name of an app. The actual real word is ojek, motorcycle taxi. So I got a guy to take me all that distance. And you know what? You get burnt easy here in the tropics. So I thought, I'm gonna lather up with sunscreen. And I absolutely poured it on, all over my face and my arms and my legs. And as we were going along, well, there was lots of dust, like lots of dirt roads, lots of trucks blowing diesel fumes. And by the time halfway through the day came along, I was absolutely caked in soot and dust and muck, just like a coal miner from the 1950s. Traveling long distances by ojek is one of life's great joys. I've done it quite a few times now, in Java primarily. And what happens is, because you're on a long distance journey, you'll often stop at the side of the road for a bite to eat with the driver, and you'll eat whatever he's eating. You'll probably shout him a meal as well. And when a thunderstorm rolls in, you'll either stop the bike and scoot under someone's roof, or you'll just get under his rain poncho and hide away until that thunderstorm goes away. I've got so many vivid memories of going through the tropics on an ojek, and it's one of those things that I am ever grateful for having done. It's a little bit feral, to be honest, but it's just glorious. Let's talk about food and warongs. The first time I ever ate in a masakan Padang restaurant was actually in Sumatra, which is where the food is originally from. I'd always seen it and always thought of it as being grotty food, dirty food, and something that I just never wanted to touch. But at some point, you've got to do it if you're traveling through Indonesia, because sometimes you can't get the food you want. So I tried this masakan Padang for the first time. It's one of those places where they've got all the food pre-cooked in the window, and then they bring out like 20 dishes and plonk them on your table, and then you just eat the ones that you want. And gee, I absolutely loved that meal. It was one of the tastiest meals I'd had up until that point, and it left an indelible impression upon me for my future travels here in Indonesia, and actually gave me a good leg up for all the different warongs that I've tried after that. Now, Padang food is Tuesday lunch without even thinking about it. And I guess that's the entire arc of this video. It's about looking at a warong and seeing those grimy walls, the plastic chairs, no English menu, food that you can't really identify, and thinking, you know what, this could be good. And finding out after you've tasted it that this is the best food in town, and it always is. Going feral with your food choices here in Indonesia is not about taking a risk. It's about a reward, to be honest, because every time you try a new Indonesian food at one of those warongs, you get yourself a little bit more educated about what it is to eat Indonesian food and get used to some of the flavors they've got on offer. I absolutely love it. It's one of my favorite parts of becoming feral here in Indonesia, is actually getting really close to the food situation here. It's just amazing. Now, going feral doesn't always have great consequences. Let me tell you about my arm. You get bitten by mozzies a lot here in Indonesia. I'm no different, I get bitten by mozzies. And one time I had a mozzie bite, and I scratched it and it bled. Well, that sometimes happens, you know. And then it got a scab, and then I picked the scab and it bled again. And as was always bound to be the case, it got infected. And with infections, you sort of go, oh, it'll be all right, a couple of days, it should be over. But then I got a fever, and then I got a lump under my arm. One of my lymph nodes had become swollen, and the arm started getting red. And I thought, gee, this is getting a bit serious. I'll have to go to the doctor and get sorted out. So I went to the doctor, a local doctor in Bandung, and it was actually a Sunday, so there weren't many doctors around. Went to the doctor and I had a consultation. He looked at my arm and he said to me, I think you've got a stomach virus. And I went, nah, my arm's infected. Nah, this is definitely a stomach virus. What I'm going to do, I'm going to give you some drugs to clear up that stomach virus. That's really probably going to be your problem. Now, what had happened, I believe, was that he looked at me as a foreigner and thought, this guy can't handle local food. There's got to be some stomach issue. But I'm pointing at my arm with it's all red. And he's thinking it's a stomach issue. Well, in the end, I absolutely just discarded his advice. I went to the chemist on my own, got some antibiotics that I'd Googled were good for skin infections. And it cleared it up in about 3 days. It really just did the job. I was pretty worried about it for a while there though. And I guess that's the problem. When you're going out local style here in Indonesia, there are some risks that go along with it as well, because sometimes you're not going to get some of the care that you might get in Australia, for example. Sometimes those little feral things like picking a scab have their consequences. So make sure you do pick your battles, but don't pick your scabs. When I first came to Indonesia, I was the hand sanitizer guy. I was the dude pulling out the hand sanitizer all the time, making sure my hands were sterile. I was the guy that was not having salads, not having ice, making sure that the water bottle I got at the table was sealed and that, you know, no one had opened it before it was brought to the table, not drinking any water from a cup that someone had served from me because maybe they got the water from the tap, and I guarantee you they didn't. That was me. And I think that's everyone the first time they come to Bali, they come to Indonesia, because we hear so many horror stories about getting Bali belly and this sort of stuff. And as time goes by, you come to realise that most of those things are not the reasons you're getting sick, and you start to loosen up just a little bit. I get asked about this a lot. So here's the story about the ice here in Bali and most of Indonesia. Ice is generally made in ice factories. It's very rarely made from some person who's gotten water and frozen it themselves in a freezer. It's just cheaper to get it from an ice factory. Even a small warong is going to get it from an ice factory. Now, occasionally, you'll have a vendor on the side of the street who might have an ice box that's chipping off blocks of ice and then using it in drinks. But even then, they're not going to be using dirty water because their customers don't want to get sick, and they won't have any local customers if they're serving dirty water. Locals cannot drink water that's not either boiled or purified like those big bottles of water you get from a mini market. So you'll find that ice is really not a problem. You know what I find makes most people sick here in Indonesia? It's usually Western style restaurants trying to cater for Western tastes that don't do a very good job of it, that you get most of the problems from. Hello, hello, hello. Those are the sorts of places I think you have more risk. There are food hygiene issues that go on behind the scenes that we can never, ever know what's happening. For example, someone might have bought some chicken from the market and it got left out for a few hours. That sort of stuff can happen. But that can happen whether it's a warong or a 5-star restaurant. It can. The sickest I ever got was actually in a hostel in Jakarta where I had a fruit salad. And it was the sickest I'd ever been from Bali belly. It was a serious, serious illness, a serious food poisoning. And the funny thing is, the next day I flew to Burma. And I was sick in Burma for about 2 weeks. And I know it was the fruit salad because I'd eaten nothing else except the fruit salad. And geez, it was a shocker. It wasn't just a one punch and I was done. It was like a one punch. And as I was getting better, I just sort of stood up and I thought, I think I'm getting better. And then it went smash and gave me one right in the jaw and I was down again. It was terrible. Now, I'm not saying throw all caution to the wind, but what I am saying is that a lot of this paranoia has a root in the way that we view Indonesia rather than based on fact. When we Westerners first come to Southeast Asia, whether it be Australians, British, Americans, Dutch, or what have you, and we see these squat toilets, the dirty warongs, and we recoil from it and we think, that's just not for me. There's sort of an assumption built in, and it's that we are the civilized ones and they are the dirty ones. They are the uncivilized ones. They are the savages. And that assumption has real history. It's what drove colonialism back in the days. It's the assumption that Western civilization is advanced and other civilizations are lesser and more primitive and perhaps even a little bit feral. But after having spent 15 years here, traveling how people travel, eating how people eat, sitting in the kampong and just observing life, you get to realize that the people here are just people. They're managing their lives, they're loving their loved ones, they're mourning the loss of people who die. They might do it in different ways. And sometimes we may even think that people aren't upset when people die here. But they certainly feel it just as we feel it. And many of the things here are much better than we do in the West. The bum guns, for example, are brilliant. The food is just another level. The communal eating, the way that family is so important to one another. Community is important. They've got that in spades here. Going feral for me was actually about dismantling a set of assumptions that I didn't even know I really had. And when you start using the bum gun, you start eating at warongs, you start going with the flow of traffic, and you don't start expecting Indonesia to become Australia just with better weather and cheaper prices, you actually start to arrive. You start to be here. You start to accept this is your new home. So next time a friend or a loved one goes past a warong and says, oh, that's filthy, or they look at a bum gun and say, that's feral, just tell them that this is Indonesia and that's the way things are done around here. And they've been doing it for a lot longer than they have been doing it in a place like Australia. That's the story of how I went feral here in Indonesia. Thanks for coming along for the ride today, and thanks for watching. Make sure you hit that subscribe button to keep up to date with all things Sonora and the rest of Indonesia. I'll catch you next time, and sampai jumpa.